In this video, we will discuss how we can use jQuery with Angular. Now, jQuery is a very stable library. It has been around for a long time. So definitely, there can be scenarios that you are using Angular in your project and you would like to also use jQuery. But it is not so simple. For example, now you can see that over here, I have created a very simple application where I have a controller called as SomeController. It has a property called as name, and this name I have tied up with a text box. I've used our ng model. I've tied up with a text box, and I'm using the expression to display the data. So when I type on this text box, the data is getting displayed. Now let us say that you are using jQuery and you are manipulating this text box. So your expectation would be that as soon as jQuery goes and manipulates this text box, your expectation would be that even the expression would change and even the Angular object should get updated. But that does not happen. So for example, now let us say, so let me first go and pull jQuery at the top. So over here, let us go and create a very simple button. Click, and on click we will go and set values. So I'll say a function set values, right? So what I will do is I will give a ID value to this text box. So I'll say here ID is equal to txt1. So let us say now over here we will say $. Again, in case you are new to jQuery, my suggestion is to go and watch the jQuery videos what we have. So in jQuery, if I want to go and set this text box value, so I have to say $, then I have to write the selector. So at this moment, because I'm selecting by ID, I have to say here hash txt1 dot val, let us say changed by jQuery, right? So now let us go and run this application. So I'll do a control F5. So let me click here. You can see now he has changed the text box value, but you can see that the Angular expression has not changed. Let me do a F12 and let us go and see the Batrang tool. So let us go and see that what exactly is happening inside Angular, right? So you can see that at the top, if you remember in one of the previous lectures, I said we have the ng root which corresponds to the ng app, and then we have the $scope which corresponds to the root of to the bottom objects of the root scope. So you can see that yes, there is a $scope, and in that we have this name value which is set to text. If I go and click over here, you can see that he only changes the UI part, but he does not affect my Angular objects, right? And because he does not affect my Angular objects, that's why he does not affect my expression as well. So now the first question comes to our mind is that why is it happening? When we go and type something, Angular works, but when we go and change from jQuery, Angular does not work. Now, if you remember in one of the previous lectures, I talked about Angular DOM. I said that Angular has a DOM, where at the top we have the root scope, and then we have the scope objects, and then inside the scope objects we have the model. Now remember that we have actually two DOMs. If you remember, I said whatever HTML you have written, the first thing what happens is the browser goes, he runs, and he creates a HTML DOM. A HTML DOM has a document at the top, then it has a form, then it has all those things. And on this top DOM, Angular DOM is created of the root scope and $scope. So now what happens is when you actually go and manipulate via jQuery like this, you are actually manipulating the DOM of HTML. So if you manipulate the DOM of HTML, it has no effect on the Angular DOM. Angular DOM is a separate thing altogether, right? So when I go and click over here, I'm actually manipulating the HTML DOM, and HTML DOM has nothing to do with Angular DOM. So he does not connect with Angular DOM, right? So now the next question is that how do we go and update Angular DOM? Because so the right process here is that via jQuery, you have to update the Angular DOM, and the Angular DOM would update the HTML DOM, and the HTML DOM would then update the display of the HTML. So in other words, jQuery should not be manipulating the DOM of HTML. He should be manipulating the DOM of Angular, right? So when I say that you want to manipulate the DOM of Angular, he has to get hold of the root scope and the $scope object. Without that, you cannot manipulate the DOM, right? So now in this case, if you see, we have one root scope object which is created on the ng app, and one scope object which is created on the ng controller, right? So this text box is associated with this scope object which is created over here on this div tag. So in order to get access to the scope object associated with this text box, the first thing is let us go and get the text box reference. So I'll say first let us get the text box reference. So the first step is get the text box reference. Okay. Second, in order to get the scope object associated with this text box, you have to say where scope, and then you have to call the Angular API, and to the Angular API we have a method here called as an element, an array of elements, and in this element I am saying now please go to this text box reference and get me the scope object. And on this scope object, let us first go and display this variable here called as name, right? So let us see that at least are we able to display this name value or not. Okay, so you can see the way to get the reference of the Angular scope object. What I have to do is I have to go and pass the reference of the UI, and using that reference of the UI I get the scope object, and then I get the complete get the scope object of Angular, and then I can reference the property. So if I do a control F5, if I say click, you can see now I can see test. That means that I am having a reference of the scope object. So if I say test dd, I can see that. Great, right? So that means that I have reference of the scope object. So now let us go ahead and let us manipulate it. So I'll say a scope.name, I will say changed via jQuery. So I'll say changed via jQuery, right? Great. Now let us see that this works or not. So I'll do a control F5. So now when I go and click on it, you can see that it is not doing anything, right? But now look at this. When I go and click on this and I tab out, watch this. When I tab out, it changes the value. Oh, that's magic, isn't it? Again I'll repeat. Look at this. When I click on it, it does not change anything actually, but when I tab out, it changes. So what is happening? Well, remember we had something called as the digest cycle. Now when we go and click on this, it actually goes and manipulates the Angular DOM. But remember that Angular DOM has been manipulated. In other words, it has gone ahead and manipulated the $scope dot name, right? But because digest cycle has not ran, it is not going and updating the expression and the UI values. So it is not going and updating the watchers. Remember, at this moment there are two watchers. One is the ng model and one is the expression. So both of those values are not getting updated. So in order that this code works, what we have to do is now we have to go and call the digest cycle manually. So I have to say here scope dot dollar apply. This code here kicks off the digest cycle manually. Okay, so now look at this. So I'm going to go and reload it, and now when I click on it, it now changes the value properly, right? So now this is working perfectly well. So in other words, if you are working with jQuery, you need to remember 2 points in your mind. First thing, jQuery goes and manipulates the HTML DOM. So when jQuery is manipulating the HTML DOM, it has no effect on the Angular DOM, right? If you want to make your jQuery code work properly with Angular, you have to actually manipulate the Angular DOM. And to manipulate the Angular DOM, you have to get the access of the scope object and the root scope object. And once you go and you update the scope object, you have to kick off the digest cycle manually. So this is a very small video, but it is a very important video, because when it comes to integrating Angular with jQuery, these two concepts people don't understand. First is that there are two DOMs internally, and second is that you have to update the Angular object, and the last point, you have to kick off the digest cycle manually. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. In this video, we were trying to understand how to integrate jQuery with Angular, and this integration also holds true for JavaScript. In case you are using JavaScript directly, right? So JavaScript also has to go and manipulate the Angular DOM and then call the digest cycle manually. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much.